The signal stopped at 03:47 Earth Standard Time. No warning, no countdown, no final goodbye. One moment the colony of Kepler's Reach was alive, full of people talking, laughing, working, sleeping, and the next moment it was just gone. Not gone like a power outage, not gone like a broken antenna, gone like someone had reached across the stars and simply switched it off. Commander Elia Park was the first one to notice. She was sitting in the Deep Space Monitoring Station on Lunar Base 14, halfway through a cold cup of coffee, running her usual overnight checks on the colony relay networks. She had done this job for 9 years. In 9 years, nothing interesting had ever happened. She used to joke with her coworkers that she had the most boring job in the entire human fleet. She was not joking anymore. She tapped the screen. She ran the diagnostic again. She checked the relay satellites between Earth and Kepler's Reach one by one, station by station, booster by booster. Everything on the Earth side was working perfectly. The signal was going out. It just wasn't coming back. She flagged it as a technical anomaly and sent a report up the chain. Standard procedure. It would probably turn out to be a bad relay node or a solar interference pocket. It happened sometimes, out on the edge of the Orion Spur where Kepler's Reach sat. The colony was far out, farther than most human settlements, and the communication links were long and sometimes fragile. She made herself another coffee and waited. By 05:00, nobody had explained the silence. By 07:00, 3 separate relay teams had checked the network and found nothing wrong on the human side. By 09:00, the report had reached Admiral Harlan Cross. Harlan Cross was a big man with a plain face and quiet eyes. He had spent 31 years in the human fleet. He had fought pirates in the Kessel Belt. He had navigated the political disasters of the Lori border disputes. He had lost ships, lost crew members, and once lost an entire supply convoy to a navigational error he still blamed himself for on cold nights. He was not a man who panicked easily. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. But when his aide placed the Kepler's Reach report on his desk, and he read it through twice, something cold moved through his chest. It was not fear exactly. It was more like the feeling a person gets when they are standing in a forest and they suddenly realize the birds have stopped singing. He read the report a third time. Kepler's Reach was not just a distant colony. It was one of humanity's most established outer settlements. 4.2 million people lived there. They had been there for 60 years. They had cities, universities, hospitals, farms, parks. They had 3 elected governors. They had schools full of children. They had a fleet anchorage and a population that had been born there and had never even seen Earth with their own eyes. It was their home, their whole world. And it had gone completely silent. Cross put down the report. He looked out the window of his office at the star field beyond the lunar surface. He thought for a moment. Then he picked up his communicator. "Get me a reconnaissance fleet," he said. 12 ships, best crews, fueled and ready within 6 hours. His aide hesitated. "Sir, protocol says we should wait for a second verification before." "I know what protocol says," Cross replied. He was not angry, he was very calm. That was always the thing about Cross. The calmer he sounded, the more serious things were. "Get me the ships." The 12-ship reconnaissance fleet left lunar orbit that same evening. Cross stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USCS Endeavour, and watched the stars stretch and blur as they entered hyperspace. Around him, his bridge crew worked quietly and efficiently. Nobody talked much. Everyone had read the report by now. Everyone was thinking the same thing. They came out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system 3 days later. The first thing Cross noticed was the color. Kepler's Reach had been a green and blue world, not as blue as Earth, but close. It had oceans and forests and great rolling plains of farmland that turned gold in the harvest season. He had seen photographs of it 100 times in mission briefings and colony reports. It had looked alive. What he was looking at now did not look alive. The planet's surface was dark. Not the dark of night, it was the wrong side of the planet for that. It was a dull, flat, burned dark that covered entire continents like a scar. The oceans were still there, but they were wrong somehow. Discolored. The atmosphere was full of particulate matter that caught the light of the Kepler sun and turned it a dim and sickly orange. Cross did not say anything for a long time. He just looked. Lieutenant Yeva Oren, his chief science officer, was the first to speak. She was young, barely 30, with quick dark eyes and a habit of chewing the end of her stylus when she was thinking hard. She was not chewing it now. She was staring at her sensor screen with an expression Cross had never seen on her face before. Surface temperature reads consistent with glass formation across 73% of the landmass, she said. Her voice was very flat, very controlled. The heat event was intense and uniform. It happened very quickly. I'm estimating less than 6 hours from first strike to completion. Casualties? Cross asked. Oren was quiet for a moment. I'm not reading any biological signatures, Admiral. None. Not human, not animal, not even microbial colonies in the upper soil layer. She paused again. Whatever hit this planet didn't just kill the people, it sterilized the surface. Someone on the bridge made a sound, just a small sound. Cross did not look to see who it was. He kept his eyes on the viewport. 4.2 million people. Gone. Any wreckage, he said, any sign of what hit them. That's the strange part, Oren said slowly. There's almost no debris in orbit, no spent munitions, no engine trails. Whatever attacked this world was incredibly clean about it, like it didn't want to leave evidence. She tapped her screen. There are some energy residue signatures in the upper atmosphere. I've never seen a pattern like this before. It's nothing in our database. So whoever did this, Cross said, we've never encountered them before. No, sir, we haven't. Cross finally looked away from the viewport. He turned to his communications officer. Has there been any transmission from the surface? Anything at all? One, sir, the officer said. His face was pale. It came in just before the colony went silent. It was fragmentary, barely a few seconds. Governor Solano's voice. We've cleaned it up as much as we can. Play it. The bridge was very quiet. Then a woman's voice came through the speakers, broken up by static and what sounded like tremendous noise in the background. The voice was terrified, but even through the terror it was trying to be clear, trying to get the message out. They came from the dark between stars. We had no warning. They are not any species we know. They are not responding to, they are just. And then nothing. Cross stood with his hands behind his back and listened to the silence after the recording ended. He thought about Governor Mara Solano. He had met her once at a colonial administration summit on Earth. She had been a sharp and energetic woman with a loud laugh and strong opinions about terraforming policy. She had talked about Kepler's reach like it was her child. He breathed in slowly, he breathed out. Secure the area, he said. I want every sensor array we have pointed outward, full defensive posture. Nobody transmits anything until I say so. Admiral, Oren said suddenly, I'm picking up something in the ruins of the capital city. There's a localized energy reading that's different from the rest. It's not residual heat. It's active. Cross turned. Active how? It's broadcasting, she said. She looked up from her screen. On a frequency that our systems almost missed. It's been waiting, like it was designed to go off when someone came to look. A beacon, Cross said. Yes, sir, but I don't think it's ours. They sent a shuttle down. Cross went with it, against the advice of his security chief and the quiet objections of his entire senior staff. He was an admiral. Admirals did not go on surface expeditions to destroyed colonies. But Cross had his own code, and part of that code said that if something terrible had happened, someone with enough authority to understand it should be willing to look at it directly. He owed that to the 4 million people who could no longer speak for themselves. The shuttle broke through the upper atmosphere, and descended into the orange haze. What they saw from the air was worse than the sensors had suggested. The city had been enormous, a grid of wide streets and tall buildings and green parks that had taken 60 years to build. Now it was flat. Not rubble flat the way a city looks after a bombing or an earthquake. It was glass flat. The heat had been so intense and so complete that everything had melted together into a single smooth dark surface. No walls, no streets, no trees. Just a vast dark plain stretching to the horizon, catching the dim orange light like a still and terrible mirror. Cross looked at it the whole way down and said nothing. They landed near the coordinates Orin had identified. The beacon was sitting in the middle of what had once been the central plaza of Kepler's Reach's capital. Cross recognized the location from a photograph he had once seen in a mission briefing. There had been a fountain there, and benches, and a large public clock tower. He remembered the clock tower specifically because the photograph had shown children climbing on the base of it. The beacon did not look like anything human had ever built. It was a smooth, dark cylinder about 2 meters tall, perfectly untouched by the destruction around it. Whatever heat had melted the city had left this object completely alone, as if it had been protected on purpose. There were markings on its surface, not letters or numbers in any human system, but patterns that seemed almost mathematical, structured, deliberate. Orin crouched next to it and ran her scanner over it carefully. "Whoever put this here wanted it to be found," she said. "The shielding on this thing is extraordinary. It's built to last 1,000 years if necessary." "Can you activate it?" Cross asked. "I think it activated the moment we got close," she said. "Watch." She stepped back, and the beacon came to life. A light emerged from the top of the cylinder, not a sharp beam but a wide, diffuse projection that spread out into the air above them and took shape slowly. It was a hologram, but unlike any hologram human technology produced. It was dense and detailed and three-dimensional in a way that made Cross feel like he was looking at something real. A figure formed in the light, tall nearly 3 meters, broad across the upper body. 4 arms, each ending in a hand with too many fingers. A face that was flat and wide, with large pale eyes arranged in a shallow arc across the upper half. It was dressed in something dark and structured, like armor but more elaborate. It looked like a leader. It looked like something that expected to be listened to. It looked at Cross, or seemed to, though Cross knew it was a recording, and then it spoke. The words were not in any human language, but Orin's translation systems were running, and after a few seconds the device Cross wore in his ear began to render the speech into flat, careful English. What it said was this: "You are the biological species designated as humans. You have established territorial presence in a zone classified as sacred expansion space under the authority of the Varrock Dominion. Your presence was unauthorized. Your settlement has been reclaimed in accordance with Dominion law. This is not an act of aggression. This is administration." The figure paused. Its pale eyes were blank and patient. "You will now be given the terms of your continued existence. You will withdraw all territorial claims beyond your origin system within 60 standard cycles. You will dismantle all military capability beyond basic system defense. You will register your species with the Dominion Expansion Bureau and await processing for potential integration. Failure to comply fully and within the given time will result in the sequential elimination of all human settlements until your origin world alone remains. Further continued resistance will result in the elimination of your origin world." Another pause. "The Varrock Dominion does not negotiate with unregistered species. This communication is a courtesy. It will not be repeated. Compliance is expected." The hologram faded. The beacon went dark. Cross stood in the middle of the glass plane for a long time. The wind moved across the smooth, dark surface around him and made no sound because there was nothing left for it to move through. No leaves, no flags, no loose debris. Just silence and the faint orange glow of the sky above. He thought about Governor Solano's voice in the recording. the terror in it. He thought about the children who used to climb on the clock tower in this plaza. He thought about the word the alien figure had used. Administration. They had killed 4.2 million human beings and called it administration. Cross looked at Lieutenant Oren. She was still crouching near the beacon, but she had stopped running her scanner. She was just looking at it. When she looked up at Cross, her eyes were very bright, the way eyes get when a person is working very hard not to show what they are feeling. "Package the beacon," he said. "Everything you can record about it, record. Every sensor reading, every translation log, every frequency it used. I want a complete picture." "Yes, sir." "And get me a secure channel to Earth," he said. "Highest encryption we have. I need to speak to the Council directly." He walked back toward the shuttle slowly. He took one last look at the horizon, at the long, flat, burned darkness that stretched in every direction where a city full of human beings had stood that morning. They had called it reclamation. Cross did not have a word yet for what he was feeling. It was not quite grief, and it was not quite anger. It was something that sat below both of those things. Something very old and very deep that had no name, but that every human being who had ever stood over the grave of someone they had failed to protect would recognize. He filed it away. There would be time for it later. Right now, he had work to do. The message reached Earth 8 hours later. In the Geneva chamber of the United Earth Interstellar Council, men and women who had spent their careers managing trade disputes and terraforming schedules and immigration policy sat in their seats and watched a recording of an alien figure tell them that they had 60 cycles to give up everything humanity had built beyond its home system, or die. Some of them went pale, some of them went very still, some of them looked at each other. The chamber was normally a loud place, debating, arguing, voting, making the noise of a civilization managing its own complicated affairs. Now it was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. Council Speaker Adiz Nwachukwu did not go pale. She sat at the head of the great curved table and watched the hologram play through to its end. Then she sat quietly for a moment with her hands folded in front of her. She was 62 years old, with close-cut gray hair, and a face that had spent a lifetime learning to be unreadable when it needed to be. She had governed. She had negotiated. She had dealt with crises that would have broken other people and had always found a way through them. She watched the alien figure's pale eyes in the recording one more time. Administration. She thought about what 4.2 million people looked like. She thought about a colony that had taken 60 years to build. She thought about the word reclaimed being used to describe the murder of an entire world full of human beings. Then she turned to the chamber and she spoke. Not with anger, with the particular quietness that people use when they have moved past the place where anger lives and arrived somewhere else entirely. "Get me Admiral Cross," she said. "And get me everything we have on the Varrock Dominion, everything. Every intelligence report, every whisper, every rumor, and every database we have." She paused. "And tell Admiralty Command to start making preparations. I want options on my desk within 24 hours. She looked around the chamber at the faces of her colleagues, the shock, the fear, the disbelief. "This council will meet again tomorrow," she said. "And when we meet, we will decide what kind of people we are going to be." She closed the session. Outside the windows of the Geneva chamber, the sun was setting over the old city, turning the sky above Earth a deep and burning gold. It was a beautiful evening on the homeworld of the human species, the planet where humanity had first stood upright and looked at the sky and wondered what was out there. Now they knew. And now they had 60 cycles to decide what they were going to do about it. In the deep dark of space, the ruins of Kepler's reach sat silent and glassed over under an alien sun, waiting for an answer that the Varrock Dominion had never once considered would be anything other than surrender. They had made a mistake. They just didn't know it yet. The news did not stay secret for long. It never did, no matter how many encryption layers the Council put around a transmission. No matter how many classified stamps were pressed onto how many reports, information like this had a way of finding the open air. Within 48 hours of Admiral Cross's message reaching Earth, fragments of the story had begun spreading across the human communication networks. By the end of the third day, every human world in every system had heard some version of it. Kepler's reach was gone. An alien empire had destroyed it. And they had delivered an ultimatum. The reaction across human space was not uniform. Fear was part of it, a cold, immediate fear that came from realizing that the universe contained something large and old, and powerful enough to glass an entire colony like it was swatting a fly. There was grief too, enormous grief, especially among the people who had family on Kepler's reach, or who had friends there, or who had once visited and remembered the streets and the buildings and the faces. 4.2 million names that now had no one left to carry them. But underneath the fear and the grief, in the quiet places where people sat alone and thought, there was something else. Something that humans had always carried in their blood and their bones and their very particular history. Something that had never allowed them to simply lie down and accept what larger forces declared was inevitable. It did not have a clean name. It was not quite anger and not quite pride and not quite stubbornness. It was all three of those things woven together with something older, the same feeling that had driven human beings to cross oceans on wooden boats when they had no idea what was on the other side. The same feeling that had made them point rockets at the moon and climb inside and light the engines. The same feeling that had kept them alive through ice ages and plagues and wars, and every other catastrophe a difficult universe had thrown at them across hundreds of thousands of years. Whatever the Varrock Dominion was, humans had faced something terrible before. They were still here. The embassies began arriving on the second day. Not human embassies, alien ones. It turned out that the galaxy was considerably more populated than humanity's limited exploration had suggested, and a significant portion of it had become very interested in what the small biological species called humans was going to do. Ships arrived in Earth orbit bearing flags and frequencies that the Council's communication teams worked frantically to decode and respond to. Some of them were merely curious. Some of them were genuinely sympathetic. But the message that most of them carried was the same, delivered with varying degrees of diplomacy and varying degrees of pity. Comply. The Valori Collective sent an ambassador, a tall, thin being with a face like weathered silver and eyes that had seen centuries pass. Ambassador Velthira spoke with measured sadness in the council chamber, standing at the great visitors' podium with the patient sorrow of someone delivering news they had delivered before. The Varrock Dominion is not an adversary, Velthira said, her translator rendering the clicks and tones of the Valori language into careful English. It is a fact, like gravity, like the expansion of space. It simply is. We the Valori have existed alongside the Dominion for 9,000 years, and we are still here, and we are here because we learned early that the universe is not arranged around the preferences of any single species. She paused, and something in her face shifted slightly, something that might have been genuine sympathy. Your colony was lost. This is a tragedy, but the choice before you now is between loss and extinction. We urge you with all sincerity to choose wisely. The Sen Republic sent a delegation of 7, a small, quick-moving species with iridescent skin that changed color with their emotional state. They were mostly gray when they spoke, which the translation team noted meant something between resignation and anxiety. Their message was shorter and more direct. We lost 3 of our own worlds to the Dominion expansion 700 years ago, their lead delegate said. We did not fight. We are alive because we did not fight. We are telling you this not because we wish you to suffer what we suffered. We are telling you because the alternative to what we suffered was not survival. The ancient Dravathi observers sent no ambassador. They sent a text communication, just text, no voice, no image, nothing more. That was 3 sentences long. The Varrock Dominion has never been defeated in 11,000 years of expansion. 89 species have chosen resistance. None of them remain. Consider this information carefully. One by one, across a week of sessions that stretched long into every night, the alien representatives came to the council chamber and said the same thing in different ways. Comply. Comply, please comply. You are young and small and you do not understand what you are dealing with. The Varrock are not cruel for the pleasure of it. They are merely very old and very large and very certain that the galaxy exists for their use. You cannot fight the tide. No one can fight the tide. The council listened to all of it. They took notes. They asked questions. They were respectful and attentive and gave every delegation the full and serious attention that the situation deserved. And then, when the last embassy had said its piece, Council Speaker Adiz Nwachukwu stood up. The chamber was full. Every seat at the great curved table was occupied, and the observation galleries above were packed with staff and advisors and reporters and council aides. The walls of the chamber displayed the flags of every human world, every colony, every station, every settlement that humanity had built across its decades of expansion into the stars. There were more flags than most people realized. Humanity had been quietly busy. Nwachukwu stood at the center podium. She had no notes in front of her. She had spent the previous night writing what she wanted to say, and then she had put the paper away, because the things she needed to say did not live on paper. They lived in the chest, and they had been there since the moment she first heard the word that the alien figure in the beacon recording had used. Administration. She looked around the chamber, at the human faces, the fear in some of them, the grief in others, the waiting in all of them. They were waiting for her to tell them what kind of people they were going to be. She breathed in, she began. I have listened to our guests, she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The chamber was absolutely silent. I have listened carefully, and I respect the experience they carry. They have lived alongside the Dominion for thousands of years, and they have survived, and that survival was not nothing. It cost them things we cannot imagine, but they are alive, and that counts for something. She paused. I want to say something clearly, so that every person in this room and every person watching this session on every human world understands what is being asked of us. Her voice was still calm, still measured, but something in it had changed, some deeper register coming forward. The Varrock Dominion killed 4.2 million human beings. They killed men and women and children. They killed people who had built their lives and their families and their homes on that world over 60 years. They did not ask those people to leave. They did not warn them. They did not negotiate. They came out of the dark between stars and they killed everyone, and then they sent us a message and called it administration. The chamber was so quiet that the words seemed to hang in the air long after she had said it. And now we are being advised, she continued, by species who have already lost their own worlds, who have already swallowed this same instruction, who have already agreed that some things in this universe are simply too large to resist. We are being advised to do the same, to give up what our people built, to go back to our home system and wait and be processed for integration, and accept that the murder of 4.2 million of our people was, in the end, just a cost of doing business in a galaxy we apparently do not have permission to exist in. She let that sit for a moment. I cannot do that, she said simply. This council cannot do that, not because we are reckless or foolish or unaware of the danger, but because we did not crawl out of the mud of one small world and cross the dark between stars to kneel before anyone. Because if we surrender now, if we pack up what we have built and retreat and register ourselves with their bureau and wait for processing, then the 4.2 million people we lost on Kepler's Reach died for a civilization that decided it was not worth defending. And I will not do that to them. This council will not do that to them. She looked around the chamber one more time. "We do not surrender," she said. "That is my recommendation to this body. Now vote." They voted. It was not close. Every delegate from every human world cast their vote, and when the count was complete, the number on the board was unanimous. Not a single abstention, not a single dissent. The United Earth Interstellar Council, representing 4.2 billion living human beings across dozens of worlds, voted to refuse the Varrock Dominion's ultimatum in its entirety. The alien ambassadors in the observation gallery watched in silence. The Valori ambassador, Velthira, sat very still with her long hands folded in her lap. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, which had seen centuries come and go, held something in them that might have been a very old and very complicated kind of respect. After the vote, Nwachukwu did not make another speech. She simply closed the session and walked with quiet purpose to the private briefing room where Admiral Cross and the heads of Admiralty Command were already waiting. She sat down at the head of the table and looked at the officers assembled before her. "Tell me where we stand," she said. Cross had returned from Kepler's Reach the day before. He had said very little publicly since his return. He had done what he always did when the situation was serious. He had been very calm and very quiet and had directed his full attention to the work. The work, in this case, was a classified briefing that he had spent the entire flight back from Kepler's Reach preparing. He placed a data chip on the table and looked at Nwachukwu. "Madam Speaker," he said, "I need to tell you about something called Iron Shepherd." There were things about humanity that the rest of the galaxy did not know. This was by design. 200 years earlier, when humanity had first made contact with the wider galactic community and discovered very quickly that the universe was full of species that regarded new arrivals, the way territorial animals regarded strange creatures that had wandered too close to their territory. A group of very serious people had sat in a very quiet room and made a decision. The decision was this: humanity would smile. It would trade. It would attend summits and sign agreements and participate in the carefully maintained rituals of interstellar diplomacy. It would present itself to the galaxy as what it appeared to be: a young, curious, peacefully inclined species with a modest collection of colonies and a small defense fleet, and a genuine interest in getting along with its neighbors. And behind that face, in the deep dark of uninhabited systems, in asteroid belts no one else bothered to map, in shipyards built inside hollowed moons so far from any travel lane that no passing ship would ever pick up their energy signatures, humanity would build. The program had a name: Iron Shepherd. It was known to fewer than 200 people in the entire human government at any given time. Admirals retired and were replaced and passed the knowledge on. Council speakers were briefed in their first week of office and then sworn to silence. The shipyard workers themselves were carefully selected and lived and worked in complete isolation, rotating on 10-year assignments, with families who believed they were working on deep space mining operations. It was, arguably, the largest and most disciplined secret in human history. And it had been running for 200 years. Cross walked Nwachukwu and the assembled command staff through the numbers slowly and clearly. He put them up on the display screen one category at a time, giving each figure space to land before moving to the next. Destroyer-class vessels, cruisers, carriers, battleships, the great Epic-class dreadnoughts, each one the size of a small city, with gravitational fields strong enough to bend light and weapon systems that had been designed and tested and refined over 2 centuries to fight exactly the kind of war they had never expected to have to fight but had prepared for anyway, because that was what serious people did. When he got to the final number, the total fleet count, the room was very quiet. Someone at the far end of the table said very softly, "That can't be right." "It's right," Cross said. Nwachukwu looked at the number for a long time. 700,000 warships, she said. "Yes, ma'am." And the Varrock Dominion's intelligence agencies have no idea this exists. They believe we have somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 vessels at best, Cross said. We have spent 2 centuries making sure that is what they believe. We have been very careful. Nwachukwu leaned back in her chair. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the briefing room, the council chamber was beginning to empty, and somewhere in the building the alien ambassadors were preparing their own transmissions home to report on humanity's decision to reject the ultimatum. The Varrock Dominion would be informed soon, and they would begin their preparations accordingly, based on everything they believed they knew about human military capability. They were going to make their plans around an enemy that did not exist anymore, or rather, an enemy that had never existed in the first place. The small, modest, peacefully inclined species with the 3,000 to 5,000 ships. They had 60 cycles to figure out their mistake. Admiral Cross, Nwachukwu said. Her voice was steady. There was a particular quality to her stillness that had always impressed the people who worked around her, the sense that she had already processed what was in front of her and arrived somewhere beyond the initial shock of it, to the place where decisions were made. How long do you need? Cross thought for exactly 3 seconds. 30 cycles, he said, to get everything positioned and coordinated. The shipyards will begin full activation within the week. Then we have 30 cycles, she said. She stood up. The people in the room stood with her. I want updates every 48 hours. I want the activation kept under the existing protocols for as long as possible. And I want every crew, every ship, every officer and engineer and navigator in Iron Shepherd to know one thing before they leave for their assignments. She paused. They are going to answer for Kepler's reach, she said. Every one of them is going to know exactly what they are going out there for. Not for empire, not for territory, for 4.2 million people who didn't get a warning, and for every person on every human world who deserves to know that if the dark between stars ever sends something for them, something will come back. The room was quiet. Then Cross said, "Yes, ma'am." And the preparations began. In their embassies across Earth, the alien representatives drafted their reports home. The Valori ambassador sat alone in her quarters that night and thought about the vote she had watched. She thought about the way the speaker's voice had sounded when she said the word administration. She had lived for 600 years. She had seen many species make brave decisions that they did not survive. But she had also seen something in that chamber that she was struggling to name, something in the faces of the human delegates, not the recklessness of a young species that did not understand the risk. Something older than that. Something that had the weight of long experience behind it. She composed her report carefully. At the end, she added a personal note to her government's High Council, something she rarely did. I have advised these humans to comply. They have refused. My professional assessment is that this will end badly for them. But I want to note, for the record, that I am not certain I have ever seen a species refuse an ultimatum from the Varrock Dominion and look, while doing so, like they knew something the rest of us did not. I may be wrong, but monitor this situation closely. Something about it is not what it appears to be. She sent the report. Then she sat by her window and looked out at the lights of Earth cities spreading across the darkness below, and she thought about gravity and tides, and all the other things that everyone always said could not be fought. She thought about them for a long time. Deep in a system with no name on any public star chart, in a region of space that most navigational databases listed as empty, something was waking up. The first sign was heat, not the sharp, bright heat of weapons fire or reactor explosion, but the slow, spreading warmth of enormous systems coming online after long stillness. The kind of heat that a planet gives off when the sun first reaches it after a long night. Sensors anywhere near the system would have picked it up if there were any sensors nearby. There were none. That was the point. The second sign was light. Shipyard lighting was always the first thing to activate in a full facility startup, long rows of illumination panels stretching across structures that were absolutely enormous, built inside the hollowed cores of asteroids and moons, where the rock itself served as camouflage and insulation. When the lights came on inside Shipyard Complex 7, they lit up interior spaces so large that the far end disappeared into a kind of manufactured haze. And there, in the light, in rows that stretched farther than any individual could see without aid, were the ships. Chief Engineer Dara Kowalski stood on the observation walkway above Bay 12 and looked out at what 200 years of human patience and secrecy had produced. She had worked in the Iron Shepherd program for 11 years. She had seen the ships before. She had been surrounded by them for more than a decade, had walked their hulls and worked their engines and spent countless hours with her hands in their mechanical guts fixing and improving and certifying them for a mission she had sometimes wondered, in the quiet of her bunk at night, would ever actually come. She was not wondering that anymore. The activation order had arrived 3 days ago, a single coded transmission that had gone to every classified facility simultaneously, carrying a message so short it barely filled a line. Iron Shepherd, full activation. This is not a drill. Godspeed. Kowalski read it 6 times on her personal screen. Then she put her screen away and went to work. The scale of what was coming online across human space in those 30 days was not something that could be easily described. Numbers helped, but numbers on a page were still just numbers. The reality of 700,000 warships, the physical presence of them, their weight and size, and the sheer amount of human labor and ingenuity and carefully held secrecy that had produced them. That was something that had to be seen to be properly understood. The smallest ships in the fleet were the destroyer-class vessels, fast and precise, built for speed and surgical strikes rather than sustained combat. There were 140,000 of them. Each one was approximately 300 meters long. Each one had a crew of 60 and was armed with weapons systems that had been quietly, incrementally improved across 2 centuries of engineering progress, while every other species in the galaxy assumed humans were still flying the same basic patrol vessels they had shown at diplomatic summits 30 years ago. The cruisers were larger, 200,000 of them, ranging from 500 meters to over a kilometer in length. They were the backbone of the fleet, built for sustained engagement, with heavy armor and redundant systems and weapons arrays that could be reconfigured during a battle to respond to changing conditions. Human engineers had spent decades studying every piece of alien military technology that trade and diplomacy had given them access to, and then they had gone away and quietly built something better. The carrier-class vessels were fewer in number, but vast in scale, 30,000 ships that each carried between 200 and 400 smaller fighter craft in their bays. Carriers did not fight close battles. They were force multipliers, hanging back in a conflict and pouring fighters into space faster than an enemy could track or respond to. The battleships, 220,000 of them, slow, almost stately, bristling with weapons and sheathed in armor so thick that conventional weapons simply bounced off it. They were the hammer of the fleet. Nothing human had ever built was more directly intended to make an enemy regret a decision. And then there were the Epic-class dreadnoughts. There were 10,000 of them. Each dreadnought was between 15 and 30 kilometers long, not a ship in any conventional sense, but something closer to a mobile fortress. They generated their own gravitational fields, which meant smaller vessels could actually land on their hulls rather than docking in conventional bays. Their weapons systems were powerful enough to crack the crust of a small planet. They had been designed not just as warships but as command platforms, each one capable of coordinating the movements of thousands of other vessels simultaneously. They were, without question, the most powerful objects humanity had ever built. And they were fueling up. The Varrock Dominion's intelligence network was excellent. 11,000 years of running an empire the size of 40% of the galaxy had given them resources and reach that most species could not comprehend. They had eyes in most of the known systems. They had informants in most of the known species governments. They had sensor arrays placed at strategic hyperspace junctions across vast regions of space that could detect ships coming and going from 100 light years in every direction. But they did not have eyes inside hollow moons. They did not have informants in a program whose existence was known to fewer than 200 people at a time. And the hyperspace junctions they monitored were the public ones, the well-traveled lanes that ships used when they wanted to get somewhere efficiently. They did not monitor the slow, careful paths through uninhabited space, through the dark between stars, that did not appear on any public navigation chart. When the Varrock intelligence apparatus began picking up unusual energy signatures from human space in the days after the Council's refusal of the ultimatum, their analysts were initially puzzled, then mildly concerned, then deeply confused. The signatures were enormous. The heat readings from certain uninhabited systems were far in excess of what any natural phenomenon could produce. There was clearly something happening, some large-scale activity, but it did not match any of the models they had built for human military capability. High-intelligence analyst Vreth Salen, a senior and well-respected member of the Dominion's Strategic Assessment Division, with 40 years of experience, prepared an initial report and submitted it up the chain to Emperor Vreth directly, as the protocols for a declared species conflict required. His assessment was cautious. He noted the anomalies. He noted that the scale of the energy readings was surprising. He suggested that humans might have more military capacity than their visible fleet implied, perhaps 8,000 ships, perhaps as many as 12,000 at a generous estimate. He recommended the Dominion deploy a secondary strike force as a precaution before the ultimatum deadline expired. The Emperor read the report. He found it overly nervous. He sent back a brief reply nodding that the Dominion had faced panicking species before, and that their displays of apparent capacity were almost always inflated by fear and desperation. He told Vreth Salen to monitor the situation, but to not alarm the High Council unnecessarily. He did not increase the strike force deployment. He had made other mistakes in 40 years of ruling an empire. This would be the last one. The Valori ambassador Velthira had been preparing to leave Earth. Her mission was complete. She had delivered her government's advice. The humans had refused it, and there was little more she could do except file her reports and arrange transport back to the Valori space. She was a professional, and she accepted outcomes she could not change. But on the 19th day of the human activation period, she received a message from a Valori intelligence contact who operated near the edge of Varrock territory. The message was scrambled and short, and had been transmitted in a hurry, and it said something that made Velthira sit down very slowly in her chair and stay there for several minutes. Her contact had been monitoring a region of space near a human system that appeared on no public charts, monitoring from a distance with very good equipment. And what her contact had seen and recorded and transmitted, even though her contact was not entirely certain the recordings were accurate because the numbers seemed impossible, was ships. Human ships. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands. And not just thousands. The message that went out from Velthira's embassy that afternoon was addressed to her government's entire High Council, marked at the highest possible priority, and it was longer than anything she had sent in her 600 years of diplomatic service. The key sentence was near the end. The humans were never small, they were waiting. By the 25th day, the story had begun to move through the galaxy in fragments and whispers. A Valori transmission intercepted by Sen relay stations. A Sen report passed to the Dravathi observers. The Dravathi, who communicated almost never but chose this moment to break their silence. Sending a single short, burst to 30 different galactic governments simultaneously. Watch the humans. Something unprecedented is occurring. The galactic community did not know the full shape of what was happening. They knew enough to be alarmed. Emergency councils were called. Old treaties were pulled out of archives and examined by nervous politicians who suddenly had new reason to think carefully about which side of a conflict they wanted to be near. Species that had not communicated with each other in decades found reasons to open channels. And in Varrock space, Emperor Vrethkalos finally received a second intelligence report from Vrethsalen. This one was not cautious. This one was the kind of report that analysts write when they have discovered something that they cannot make fit their existing understanding, no matter how many times they run the numbers. The Emperor read it. Then he read it again. Then he called for the full Intelligence Council, which was unusual enough in itself to alarm everyone who received the summons. The meeting was held in the Emperor's war room. Vrethsalen stood before the assembled council and laid out what the Dominion sensors had managed to capture, and what the energy readings implied, and what the traffic patterns suggested about ships coming out of deep undisclosed space and moving towards staging positions. "Current estimate," Vrethsalen said, and his voice was very carefully controlled, puts the human fleet count at somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million vessels. The war room was very quiet. "That is not possible," said the fleet marshal, who was the highest military officer in the Dominion. "Species do not build fleets that size in secret. The industrial output required, the energy consumption, the raw materials." "I know," Vrethsalen said, "but the readings don't lie, and there is more." He pulled up a new display. "Based on what our sensors have been able to resolve at range, the largest of their vessel types appear to be between 15 and 30 kilometers in length." The fleet marshal said nothing. "We have classified them as dreadnought analogs," Vrethsalen continued. "We estimate there are approximately 10,000 of them." More silence. The Emperor, who had not spoken since the meeting began, said very quietly, "How long have they been building this?" "Based on the aging signatures on the older vessels, at minimum 150 years, possibly as many as 200. Vrethkalos sat with that for a moment. 200 years. While the Dominion had been managing its empire, administering its territories, occasionally sending fleets to reclaim expansion space from species that had wandered where they didn't belong, the humans had been building. Quietly, patiently, with a discipline that frankly astonished him, they had been building for 200 years. And the Dominion had looked at them and seen a small, harmless species of explorers. He thought about the beacon he had authorized for Kepler's reach, the message he had approved, the word administration. "What is their current fleet disposition?" he asked. "Moving into staging formation," Vrethsalen said. "Based on vector analysis, they are positioning for a coordinated advance into Dominion space. We estimate they will be ready to move within 5 to 10 cycles." The Emperor looked at his fleet marshal. "What can we meet them with?" The fleet marshal's answer took a long time to come. "Nothing equivalent," he said finally. Admiral Harlan Cross stood on the bridge of the USCS Kepler's Reach. The ship had been renamed 3 days after the fleet activation order. It had been the flagship of the first expeditionary group before, a proud vessel with a long history. But Cross had requested the name change personally and quietly, and it had been approved within hours. He felt that the colony deserved to have something of itself represented in whatever came next. He felt that when people looked at the flag vessel of the Sol Armada, they should see that name and know what this was for. Around the flagship, in every direction as far as sensors could read, were ships, human ships. The full assembled might have Iron Shepherd 700,000 warships arranged in a formation so vast that it occupied a region of space that would have taken a single vessel hours to cross at full speed. It was the largest military fleet in the history of the human species. possibly the largest coordinated fleet in the history of this part of the galaxy. Cross did not have enough information about other species wars across thousands of years of galactic history to say for certain, but the numbers suggested it was close. He looked at it on the tactical display and allowed himself briefly to feel what it meant. He thought about Governor Mara Solano. He thought about the smooth, dark glass of the planet's surface. He thought about the word administration and how it had sounded coming through the alien translator, delivered with the complete, indifferent certainty of something that expected no answer it would have to take seriously. The answer was here. Commander Yeva Oren, promoted twice in the past 30 days and now serving as Cross's flag intelligence officer, came to stand beside him. She had changed in the month since they had stood together on the ruined surface of Kepler's Reach. The sorrow was still in her somewhere, he could see it, but it had settled into something harder and steadier. "Full fleet report is in," she said. "All 712,000 vessels confirmed operational, all crews at station, all systems nominal." "Good," Cross said. "They know we're here," Oren said. "The Dominion knows. Their sensor arrays would have picked us up when we started consolidating. They're watching." "I know," Cross said. "Good, I want them watching." He turned from the tactical display and faced the assembled bridge crew. They were looking at him with the particular attention that people give when they understand that the words they are about to hear will stay with them for the rest of their lives. He did not give them a long speech. That was not his way. He said what needed to be said in plain language without decoration. "We do not go to conquer," he said. "We go to answer. One colony fell. 4.2 million of our people are gone without warning, without mercy, without so much as the dignity of being told why. We will not ask why. We will not negotiate the terms of our species' survival with the ones who took those people from us. We will go and we will fight. And we will make absolutely certain that no one in this galaxy ever again looks at a human world and sees something that can simply be reclaimed without consequence." He paused. "But we will not harm those who do not come against us. We are not here to replace one empire with another. We are here because justice is not something the universe provides on its own. Sometimes you have to go and get it." He turned back to the viewport. "Helmsman," he said, "take us in." In every corner of the galaxy, in every council chamber and embassy and diplomatic post, the news arrived like a tide. The human fleet, the real human fleet, the one no one had known existed, had entered hyperspace. All 700,000 of them. Moving as one. The Valori ambassador sat in her quarters on Earth and read the confirmation transmission from her government. She read it once. Then she set it down and sat in silence for a long time, thinking about the vote she had watched in the council chamber, and the faces of the human delegates, and the particular quality in the speaker's voice that she had spent weeks trying to correctly identify. She thought she understood it now. It was not recklessness. It was not even anger. It was certainty. They had known. Not the exact shape of what was coming, not the specific tactics or the timing or every element of the battle ahead, but they had known, in the deep, quiet, patient way that comes from 200 years of preparation, that if this day ever arrived, they were ready for it. They had not refused the Dominion's ultimatum out of bravado. They had refused it because they could. The Valori ambassador closed her eyes. She thought about 11,000 years of Dominion expansion, about 89 species that had chosen resistance and left no descendants to tell the story, about the great tide of history that everyone had always said could not be turned. Then she opened her eyes and began composing a very different kind of message to her government. Not advice to maintain neutrality, not a recommendation to monitor the situation from a safe distance. Something entirely different. Something she had not written in 600 years of diplomatic service, because there had never, in 600 years, been a reason to write it. A request to send ships. The Varrock Dominion's Grand Teeth fleet had never lost a battle. This was not merely a point of pride. It was a historical fact that every military officer in the Dominion kept somewhere in the front of their mind, a piece of information so deeply embedded in their sense of the world that it functioned less like a fact and more like a law of nature. The Grand Teeth fleet had been assembled 4,000 years ago, when a rival empire in the galactic core had tried to push back against Dominion expansion and had needed to be answered clearly and permanently. It had answered them. It had answered 6 other challengers after that, across 4,000 years of engagements that were now preserved in the Dominion's military archives as case studies in what absolute superiority looked like in practice. 12,000 warships, the finest vessels the Varrock Dominion had ever built, crewed by the most experienced warriors in the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, equipped with technologies refined across 11,000 years of imperial expansion. They arrived at the Vreth Sor system, a major junction point in the outer territories of Dominion space, and took their positions with the quiet precision of a force that had done this before and expected to do it again, and did not particularly anticipate difficulty. Fleet Admiral Cross Venthar stood on the command bridge of his flagship and watched the sensor displays. The first wave of human ships had already emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system. His analysts were counting them as they appeared. 300 ships, 1,000 ships, 5,000 ships, 10,000, 20. The count kept climbing. At 40,000 ships, Cross Venthar asked his analyst to recheck the sensors. The analyst rechecked the sensors and confirmed the number. The count kept climbing. 85,000 human warships assembled in the Vreth Sor system. They had come out of hyperspace in a formation that Cross Venthar's tactical officers were still studying, because it was unlike anything the Dominion's war doctrine had prepared them for. The arrangement of the vessels was complex, layers within layers, fast destroyers at the outer edges, cruisers in rotating middle formations, battleships in deep defensive lines, and positioned at intervals throughout the formation. Enormous dark shapes that were the largest vessels any Dominion sensor had ever read. "Confirm class on those large contacts," Cross Venthar said. His sensor chief worked for a moment. "They are not in our classification database, Admiral. We have no equivalent. Based on mass readings, they are between 15 and 25 kilometers in length." The bridge was very quiet. Cross Venthar looked at his 12,000 ships on the tactical display. Then he looked at the 85,000 human vessels arranged across the Vreth Sor system. He thought about the orders he had received from the Emperor: hold the line, push back the human advance, demonstrate the futility of resistance so clearly and decisively that the rest of the fleet would turn back before pressing deeper into Dominion space. He thought about the Grand Teeth fleet's unbeaten record across 4,000 years. He activated the fleet-wide command channel. "All ships," he said, "combat formation, advance." What happened in the next 11 hours would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for a very long time. The first thing that surprised the Dominion forces was the humans' use of what their analysts would later call layered adaptive positioning, a fluid battle formation that had no fixed structure, that reorganized itself continuously during the engagement based on where threats were emerging. Traditional Dominion battle doctrine was built around formations that could be analyzed and countered. They had classified formation types, studied their vulnerabilities, prepared tactical responses. Human formation had no fixed shape to counter. Every time the Dominion's tactical computers identified a pattern and began to calculate a response, the pattern was already something else. The second thing that surprised them was the speed. Human ships were fast, not just fast by the standards of what the Dominion had expected, fast by the standards of physics. The destroyer-class vessels in particular moved with an agility that should not have been possible for a ship their size. Dominion tactical doctrine relied on the ability to predict an enemy's position and fire on where they were going to be. Human destroyers did not behave predictably. They moved in coordinated swarms, changed direction faster than targeting systems could track, and attacked from angles that required the Dominion ships to divide their fire, and divided fire was weaker fire. The third thing was the most important, and it was not a tactical thing at all. It was a psychological thing, though the Dominion's officers did not recognize it until it was too late to matter. Humans had spent most of their history fighting each other. This was, if you looked at it from the outside, a sad and troubling thing. Species that warred among themselves were generally not viewed as particularly advanced or desirable neighbors. Most of the galactic community regarded humanity's historical warfare as evidence of a certain primitive streak that would need to be grown out of before they could be taken seriously. But the thing about fighting your own kind for hundreds of thousands of years was that you developed a very particular kind of military intelligence. When you fought other species, you learned about alien tactics, alien psychology, alien strengths and weaknesses. When you fought yourself, when your enemy was as smart as you were, as creative as you were, as adaptable as you were, you learned something more fundamental. You learned to think. Varrock military doctrine was 4,000 years old. It had been refined and improved in that time, but its foundation was ancient. An ancient doctrine assumes the enemy is fighting the way enemies have always fought. Human warfare doctrine had been rewritten dozens of times in the last 4 centuries alone, revised and challenged and turned inside out by strategists who had spent their careers trying to defeat opponents who were just as capable of revision and challenge as they were. The Grand Teeth Fleet was very good at fighting the kinds of enemies it had always fought. It had never fought anything like this. At the 3-hour mark, the Dominion right flank collapsed. Not slowly, in a coordinated sequence of human destroyer strikes that had been building for an hour, each one individually manageable, all of them together creating a cascade effect that the Varrock fleet's defensive structure could not absorb. 400 Dominion ships lost their formation cohesion and were isolated. Isolated ships did not last long. At the 6-hour mark, the Grand Teeth Fleet lost one of its 3 command vessels, a critical coordination hub for 1,100 other ships. Those ships did not stop fighting, but they stopped fighting together, and fighting alone was something very different from fighting as a coordinated unit. The humans had targeted the command structure deliberately and precisely. They had not gone for the most impressive targets. They had gone for the most important ones. At the 9-hour mark, Cross-Venthar received confirmation that he had lost 60% of his fleet. He was still fighting, but he was fighting a losing battle with fewer ships against an enemy that had not stopped adapting since the battle began. And he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had studied war his entire life, that the result was no longer in question. He did the thing that took more courage than continuing to fight. He ordered a full retreat. Get out, get away, report back. The information he was carrying was more valuable than the ships he was losing. The humans let them go. That too surprised him. Vice Admiral Suki Tanaka, commanding the 7th Expeditionary Wave from her bridge aboard the USCS Unbroken, watched the Varrock ships disengage and pull back into hyperspace. Her tactical officers were reading the final count: 8,200 Dominion vessels destroyed, 3,700 retreated. The Grand Teeth Fleet was broken. Her losses were not light. She had lost over 4,000 ships and would not pretend otherwise, and every crew manifest her officers pulled up represented people who were not going home, and that weight was real and she would carry it. But the engagement was over, and the result was exactly what it needed to be. She sent a brief message back to Admiral Cross. Vrethsor is clear, proceeding to secondary objectives. Grand Teeth Fleet is no longer an obstacle. Recommend informing the Emperor that the first lesson has been delivered. The news moved through the galaxy faster than the human ships did. The Grand Teeth Fleet, 4,000 years unbeaten, the symbol of Dominion military supremacy, had been broken in 11 hours by a single wave of human vessels that represented approximately 12% of the full Sol Armada. In the Dominion's war room, Emperor Vreth received the report from Cross Venthar's retreating staff and sat with it for a long time. His advisors spoke around him: options, responses, reinforcements, diplomatic possibilities, and he listened to them. But at the center of everything was a thought he could not stop returning to. He had been wrong. Not wrong in the way that planners sometimes misestimated an enemy's resources. He had been wrong in a far more fundamental way, wrong about what the humans were, wrong about what they had been doing for the last 2 centuries, wrong about what lay behind the pleasant, peacefully inclined face they had shown to the galaxy. He had authorized the destruction of Kepler's Reach based on what he believed about the humans. He had sent the beacon and its ultimatum based on what he believed. He had believed wrong. Across the Dominion's territory, the human advance continued. Not a charge, a methodical, deliberate push, system by system, with clear objectives and clear rules of engagement that every human vessel commander had been given in writing before the fleet moved. Military targets, infrastructure that directly supported military operations, nothing else. Human ships did not fire on civilian populations. Human ships did not destroy worlds. When they took a Dominion system, they held it, and they held it in a particular way that the Dominion's subject populations had not expected. They held it quietly. They maintained order. They made sure the essential systems were still running. They set up communication channels and broadcast simple, clear messages in the local language of whatever species lived in the system. You are not our enemy. You are under the protection of the Sol Armada until further notice. Continue your normal activities. No civilian will be harmed. In the first week, most of the subject populations didn't know what to think. They watched the human ships from whatever viewports or sensors they had available and waited to see what would happen. They had been told by their own histories that, when one empire defeated another, the first thing the winning side did was make very clear who was now in charge, usually by doing something dramatic and painful to reinforce the point. The humans brought field medics. This was strange enough that it became its own kind of story, spreading through the Dominion subject territories faster than official communications could travel. The invaders had brought doctors. They were setting up medical posts in the systems they occupied. They were treating the sick. They were being almost aggressively polite. Word reached the Sen republics. The Sen had been vassal states of the Varrock Dominion for 700 years. In those 700 years, they had lost 3 of their own worlds, as their delegate had told the council. They had accepted Dominion oversight of their economy, their military, their movement between systems. They had survived, but survival for 700 years had not been the same thing as living. Their current leader, First Minister Sailvoris, was a cautious and practical person. She had to be. 700 years of vassal status had selected for pragmatic leadership, people who could keep the Sen alive by being very careful about what they said and very conservative about what they did. The Sen had learned not to hope too loudly, because hope attracted attention, and Dominion attention was something the Sen worked very hard to avoid. But she had been watching the human advance for 15 days. She had read the reports from the occupied systems. She had listened to the broadcasts the human ships were transmitting, and she had spent 3 nights without sleep thinking about what she was about to do. She opened a back-channel communication to the Sol Armada's command frequency. It was encrypted in a cipher that her intelligence division had spent months developing, and it was routed through 3 relay points to make it harder to trace. She composed the message herself, in her own words, without assistance. To the commanding officer of the human fleet, greetings. I am First Minister Sailvoris of the Sen Republics. We have been a subject people for 700 years. We have been watching your advance with great attention. We have resources, ships, intelligence, knowledge of Dominion defensive positioning that we believe would be useful to you. In return, we ask one thing: not territory, not payment, not political alliance. We ask that if we rise against the Dominion from within, you will not leave us behind, that you will hold the line while we fight our own fight. We have waited 700 years for someone to make this question worth asking. We are asking it now. She sent it. Then she sat very still in her office and waited. She had done many practical and cautious things in her political career. This was the first thing she had ever done that felt like something more than survival. The reply came 6 hours later. It was not long, and it was not written in the elaborate diplomatic language that interstellar communications usually used. It was plain and direct, in a way that she found, after 700 years of Dominion formality, almost startling. First Minister, we received your message. We have one answer and only one. We did not come to replace one empire with another. We came to make sure no one ever destroys another world and calls it administration. Stand with us and we will stand with you, not because it serves our interest, because it is right. Supreme Commander Harlan Cross, Sol Armada. Salvoris read it twice. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She allowed herself to feel something that was not caution. She called her military chiefs. She told them to begin the preparations they had spent 700 years making only in whispers. Other species were watching. Not all of them moved as quickly as the Sen. Some had been under Dominion influence for so long that the idea of independence felt dangerous to contemplate. Some had old grievances against other potential coalition members that made common cause complicated. Some were simply afraid, and fear that has lived in a culture for centuries does not dissolve overnight. But the reports kept coming in. The human ships held their occupied systems cleanly. The field medics kept working. The broadcasts kept playing. And slowly, carefully, like something moving toward a light it wasn't sure it could trust, other species began to open their own channels. From the bridge of the Kepler's reach, Cross and Oren watched the coalition grow in real time. Colored markers on the strategic display, each color a different species, a different world, a different set of ships that had decided to align with the human advance. 7 species now, Oren said, looking at the display with an expression that had something quiet and careful in it. 12 if the Dream clusters commit. That's roughly 40,000 additional vessels. Not why I wanted them, Cross said. She glanced at him. I know, she said, but it matters anyway. He nodded. It did. Not just militarily, though 40,000 additional ships was not nothing. It mattered because of what it meant. These species were not joining because they had calculated that the human side was going to win, and they wanted to be on the winning side. Some of them were, that was honest, but the Sen were not. The Sen were joining because they had been waiting 700 years for someone to come along who made the risk worth taking. That was not strategy, that was faith. Cross was not a sentimental man, but he understood what was happening, and he felt the weight of it. These species were trusting humanity with something far more important than military alliance. They were trusting it with the hope that the humans who were fighting this war were the kind of people they appeared to be. He was going to make sure they were right. On the 32nd day of the campaign, Emperor Vrethkalos stood in his war room and looked at the strategic display of his empire. The colors were wrong. The colors had been changing every day, systems dropping out of Dominion control, the boundaries of his empire contracting in ways that the display had never shown in 11,000 years of Varrock expansion. He was not a small man. He had ruled for 40 years. He had made decisions that shaped the lives of trillions of beings across a vast empire, and he had made most of those decisions with the steady certainty of a person who understood the shape of the world and his place in it. The world had a different shape now. His fleet marshal stood beside him. Vrethsalin stood on his other side, having been pulled from the intelligence division directly into the war command. There were other advisors, other officers, arranged around the room in the positions they always occupied. Everyone was very quiet. "Tell me plainly," the Emperor said. "Not what is possible, tell me what is real." The Fleet Marshal told him plainly. The Dominion had lost 40% of its military capacity in 32 days. It had lost 23 systems to the human advance. The coalition that had formed around the humans was growing daily, and the species within the Dominion that had been held under authority by force of presence rather than genuine loyalty were beginning to act on calculations that had been shifting since the first reports came in from Vrethsor. The Empire was not just losing a war, it was beginning to come apart. "And the humans," the Emperor asked, "what do they want?" Vrethsalen answered this one. He had been studying human communications and broadcasts carefully, more carefully than anyone else in the room. "They have stated their terms in every system they have taken, and in every broadcast they have transmitted," he said. "They want accountability for Kepler's reach. They want recognition that the destruction of inhabited worlds is not administration, and they want a framework, some kind of legal structure for the rights of all species. They have not demanded our territory. They have not claimed our systems for their own. They are fighting, but they are not conquering." Vreth Kalos looked at his Fleet Marshal. "Can we continue?" The Fleet Marshal did not answer immediately. A person of lesser honesty might have given him something softer, but he was the Fleet Marshal of the Varrock Dominion, and his job was to tell the Emperor the truth. "No," he said, "not against this fleet, not against this coalition. The Grand Teeth Fleet is gone. Our remaining forces are being outmaneuvered in every engagement we attempt, and every day we continue, we lose more of the Empire to internal fracture. The species we have held will not hold indefinitely when they see what the human fleet is doing in the systems it occupies." Vreth Kalos nodded. He thought about Kepler's reach, the beacon he had approved, the word administration. He had sent that message because he had looked at the humans and seen something small. He had been looking at the wrong thing. "Open a channel," he said, "to the human Supreme Commander." "What terms, Your Majesty?" Vreth Kalos looked at the display, at the empire that his ancestors had built across 11,000 years, shrinking on the screen in front of him. "Whatever terms they are willing to offer," he said. "I think we are past the point where we have the right to negotiate our own." He sat down in his command chair and waited for the connection. Outside his war room windows, across the vast dark of space, 700,000 human ships and their growing coalition of allies held their positions and waited too. Somewhere among them, on a flagship named for the world that had started all of this, Admiral Harlan Cross received the request for communication and looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned to his communications officer. "Accept the call," he said. The communication channel opened. On the screen of the USCS Kepler's Reach, the image of Emperor Vreth Kalos appeared for the first time in direct transmission. He was not what Cross had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. The Varrock Emperor was old, visibly, deeply old in a way that crossed species lines, the particular fatigue that's settling into the face and posture of anyone who has carried very heavy things for a very long time. His forearms were still. His pale eyes were steady. He was not performing. He was not trying to project authority or manage an impression. He simply looked like a person who had run out of good options and had decided that honesty was the only one left. "Supreme Commander Cross," he said, through the translation system, "I am told you are the one who named your flagship for the colony." "I am," Cross said. "That was a deliberate choice," the Emperor said. "Everything I do is deliberate." The Emperor was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that I understand what was done at Kepler's Reach, not in the way I understood it when I authorized the beacon, as an administrative matter. I understand it now in the way that I should have understood it before. It was the murder of 4.2 million people who had done nothing except exist in a place we decided we wanted. Cross said nothing. He waited. "I do not ask forgiveness," Vrethkalos said. "I do not think I have the right to ask it, and I would not insult you by trying. I am asking what terms you are willing to offer, not because I have leverage, I know I do not, but because I want to understand what kind of people I have been dealing with, what it is you actually want from this." Cross leaned forward slightly. "Stop the ships," he said. "Yours. Order your remaining military forces to stand down and hold position. Do it publicly on every frequency so that your fleet commanders and every species in this galaxy can hear it. Then we will talk." The Emperor nodded once, and then we sit down, Cross said, and we figure out how to make sure this never happens again, to anyone. The stand-down order went out within the hour. Vrethkalos sent it personally, in his own voice, on the broadest military communication frequency in the Dominion's network. Every Varrock fleet commander in every system heard it. Most of them obeyed immediately, not because they were unwilling to fight, but because the Emperor himself had ordered them to stop, and 40 years of imperial authority still carried weight, even in the middle of a military collapse. A few holdout commanders needed more convincing. They received it from the coalition forces positioned in their systems. It was not pleasant, but it was brief. By the third day after the first communication, the guns were mostly quiet. Cross used those 3 days carefully. He did not rest. There was too much to coordinate, too many coalition partners to keep informed, too many ongoing situations to monitor. He slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest of the time working. But in a quiet hour on the second evening, he did something he had been putting off. He went to the ship's memorial room. Every major vessel in the Sol Armada had one, a quiet space set aside for the names of those who had been lost. On the Kepler's Reach, the room also contained something else, a panel that Cross had ordered installed before the fleet left the staging area. A single large panel, floor to ceiling, bearing 4.2 million names. They had spent weeks compiling the list from colonial records, every resident of Kepler's Reach at the time of the attack, every man and woman and child, in the order they appeared in the census registry. The names ran in columns so fine they were almost impossible to read individually. You had to step very close to make out a single name. From a normal distance, the panel appeared simply as a dense dark field of text, names without end. Cross stood in front of it for a long time. He found Governor Mara Solano's name. It was not hard. She was in the government registry, which was near the front. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the names around hers, the names above, the names below. He did not know those people. He did not know most of the 4.2 million. But he had stood on the surface of what had been their home, and he had seen the glass, and he had carried them with him all the way here, and he was not going to let go of them now. He stood there until it was time to go back to work. The formal negotiations took 11 days. They were held aboard the Kepler's Reach. In the largest conference room, the flagship had a space originally designed for fleet command briefings, now rearranged with a long table and chairs and standing room for the assembled representatives of every species involved in the conflict. Human diplomats sat alongside Sen ministers and the Lori observers and delegates from 6 other species who had joined the coalition. Varrock representatives sat across from them, looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the room. Council Speaker Adiz Nwachukwu had come in person. Cross had not asked her to. It was not standard practice for a head of government to attend military negotiations aboard a flagship. She had come anyway, because she had told the council that she had no intention of letting other people determine what peace meant in a war that had started with 4.2 million of her people. She sat at the center of the human side of the table and listened more than she spoke, which Cross had always found was her method when the situation was most important. The negotiations were not simple. Nothing involving an empire that had governed 40% of the galaxy for 11,000 years could be simple. There were territories to account for, species to consider, economic structures that had been built around Dominion authority for centuries. There were Varrock people, ordinary citizens who had not authorized the destruction of Kepler's Reach, and who had been as shaped by their government's choices as any other population. Their lives were going to change regardless of what this table decided, and what those changes looked like mattered. Humanity did not claim Varrock territory. This surprised the Varrock delegation, who had arrived expecting the kind of terms that a conquering force traditionally extracted. They had prepared themselves for the loss of systems, the demand for resources, the reorganization of their governance under human oversight. Instead, Nwachukwu laid 3 documents on the table. The first was an accounting of Kepler's Reach, every resident, every building, every institution, 60 years of colony history reduced to record and then to glass. It was not a legal document. It was a witness statement, and it was there so that everyone in that room and every person in every species who received the record of these negotiations would understand in concrete terms what the war had been about. Not territory, not power, people. The second document was the proposed structure of the Varrock Dominion's dissolution, not the extinction of the Varrock people, something Nwachukwu had stated in absolute terms before negotiations began was never on the table. But the Dominion as a governing structure, the empire, the authority it had claimed over other species, the apparatus of expansion and administration that had functioned for 11,000 years, that was over. The species that the Dominion had held would be given self-governance. Varrock military capacity would be reduced to system defense under monitored limits. The Expansion Bureau was to be permanently dissolved. The third document was the longest, and it was the one that would matter most in the centuries to come. It was called the Reach Accords. Nwachukwu had spent months drafting it, starting the night she received Cross's transmission from Kepler's Reach. She had worked on it in the margins of every other thing she had been managing late at night, early in the morning, on the long transit flights between council meetings. It was a framework for the rights of every sentient species in the known galaxy. The right of a species to settle and inhabit worlds without being destroyed for it. The prohibition of the deliberate elimination of civilian populations, defined clearly and without loopholes. The establishment of a multi-species high court with real authority and real enforcement capability, not a consultative body that could be ignored, but a genuine legal institution with the fleet resources of its member species behind it. It was, in effect, a constitution for the galaxy. The Varrock delegation read it carefully and thoroughly. Their lead negotiator, a gray-haired official named Vrethlona who had served in the Dominion's legal division for 30 years, spent an entire session asking detailed questions about enforcement mechanisms and jurisdictional boundaries, and how disputes between the court and member governments would be resolved. She was very good at her job, even now, even in this context. At the end of the session, she looked across the table at Nwachukwu and said, "You prepared this before the war ended." "I prepared it before the war started," Nwachukwu said. Vrethlona looked at her for a moment. "You were always going to offer this, no matter how the war went." "Yes." "Why?" Nwachukwu thought about the question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. Because justice that only exists when the powerful decide to offer it is not justice, she said. It's mercy, and mercy runs out. We want something that doesn't run out. The Varrock delegation signed the Reach Accords on the 9th day. The coalition partners signed on the 10th. On the 11th day, the agreement was broadcast on every frequency available to every species in the known galaxy. The surrender was formal. The Emperor had offered it personally, and Cross had accepted it aboard the Kepler's Reach in a ceremony that was brief and without pageantry. Cross had not wanted spectacle. He did not feel like this was a moment for triumph. He felt like it was a moment for weight, for the full awareness of what had been paid to reach it. He accepted the surrender standing in front of the panel of 4.2 million names, which he had arranged to be present in the room. He did not explain why the panel was there. He did not need to. Vrethkalos looked at it for a long time before the ceremony began. When it was over, when the documents were signed and the cameras from a dozen species media organizations had their images, the emperor turned to Cross. "The word I would use now," he said quietly, "is not administration." "No," Cross agreed. "What word do you use?" Cross thought about it. "Loss," he said. "Theirs, ours. Every species that spent centuries under your authority without choosing it. A lot of loss in all directions." He paused. "The question is what we build out of it." The emperor nodded. He looked at the panel one more time, then he left. The months after the accords were signed were not simple. Peace never was in the immediate aftermath of a conflict. There were Varrock hardliners who refused to accept the dissolution and had to be dealt with carefully, firmly, without escalating into new violence. There were species within the former dominion who found that self-governance was more complicated than they had imagined after centuries of being governed by someone else. There were economic disruptions, supply chain failures, political crises in regions that had organized their entire existence around the Dominion's administrative structure, and now had to build something new. Human personnel, diplomats, engineers, medical teams, logistical coordinators went where they were needed. Cross had authorized it from the beginning, before the war ended. The infrastructure of the coalition that had fought alongside humanity became the infrastructure of something larger, not a human empire, something that did not have a precedent and therefore did not have a name yet, though the Reach Accords provided its legal foundation. Yeva Oren, promoted again, to the rank of ambassador, representing the Sol Armada in diplomatic post-conflict work, spent most of those months in transit, moving from system to system across what had been Dominion space, meeting with local officials and community leaders, and sometimes just ordinary people who had questions and fears, and no one they trusted to answer them honestly. She had a gift for honesty. She had always had it. It was part of what had made her a good science officer, the willingness to look at what was actually in front of her and report it accurately, without comfort and without alarm, just clearly. She brought that quality to diplomacy, and people responded to it in ways they did not always respond to polished diplomatic language. On a world called Senvora, the oldest of the Sen Republic planets, a place that had been under Dominion authority since before most humans had looked up at their own sky and dreamed of reaching the stars, she sat in a community hall with 300 local residents and answered questions for 4 hours. At the end, a young Sen, barely an adult by their species reckoning, raised her hand. "What do we do now?" she asked. It was such a simple question, asked with such genuine uncertainty, that the room was very quiet when she finished asking it. Oren thought about it. "I think," she said, "you figure out what you actually want, not what you're allowed to want, what you actually want, and then you start building it. It will take longer than you expect and it will be harder than you hope and some of it won't work the first time." She paused. "But you have time now, that's the thing, you have time." The young Sen looked at her. Her skin, iridescent, shifting with emotion in the Sen way, had been gray with anxiety when she asked the question. Now it shifted slowly toward something warmer. It was not a dramatic moment. It was just a person in a community hall beginning, very carefully, to believe that things could be different. Oren thought about it for days afterward. On Earth, in the Geneva chamber, the old curved table had been replaced. The new table was larger, considerably larger, because the new council had considerably more members. Every species that had joined the Reach Accords sent representatives, and representatives needed places to sit. And the old table had been built for humans alone. The new one was a great ring, wide and circular, without a head or a foot, because the architects had been given specific instructions by Council Speaker Nwachukwu. No seat at this table should look more important than any other. On the day the new High Court convened for the first time, Nwachukwu stood at her place in the ring and looked around at the faces assembled there. Human faces, and the Lori faces, and Sen faces, and Dravathi faces and faces from species whose names humans were still learning to pronounce correctly. And she did not make a long speech. She had made enough long speeches in the past year to last several lifetimes. She placed one thing at the center of the table, a photograph printed on physical paper in a simple frame. It was a family portrait, a woman and a man and 3 children standing in front of a sunset on a world that no longer existed. They were all smiling. The children had clearly been told to stand still and smile nicely for the photograph, and were doing so with the particular slightly too posed effort of children who would rather be running around. The parents were smiling the way parents smile when they are watching their children try to behave and finding it quietly wonderful. The photograph had been recovered from the ruins of Kepler's Reach by one of Cross's surface teams. The metadata identified the family by name. The names were on the panel aboard the Kepler's Reach, every one of them. Nwachukwu looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she looked up at the room. "We did not do this for glory," she said. "We did not do this for empire. We did this because 4.2 million people deserved someone who would answer for them. Let this table and this law be that answer for every world, for every species, for every family that ever dared to look up at the stars and call them home." No one clapped. It was not the kind of moment for it. They just sat with what she had said, each person in the ring carrying it in whatever way their particular nature and history allowed. Then they got to work. 6 months later, Yeva Oren was standing on the surface of Senvora. It was a clear day. The Sen sun was different from Earth's, a little older, a little warmer, casting the light at an angle that made everything look slightly golden. The landscape was rolling plains of something that looked almost like grass but wasn't, and in the distance was a city that was in the process of rebuilding itself. Scaffolding visible on half a dozen structures, where new construction was going up to replace old Dominion administrative buildings that the population had torn down with considerable enthusiasm. Children were playing in a park near where Oren was standing. Sen children, quick and bright-eyed, with skin that flashed through colors so fast it was like watching weather pass across a landscape. They were chasing something, though she couldn't tell what, some game with rules she didn't know, and their laughter was a sound she didn't need a translator to understand. She stood and watched them for a while. She thought about Kepler's Reach, about the smooth, dark glass where a city had stood, about the beacon standing untouched in the center of the plaza, designed to last 1,000 years, delivering its cold and certain ultimatum to whoever came to look. She thought about the look on Cross's face when he came back from the surface that first day, the thing he had carried back with him that had no name. She thought about the 4.2 million names on the panel aboard the flagship. The Varrock Dominion had looked at a human colony and called it administration. The word the galaxy would use now was different. The word the galaxy would use for a very long time was the name of the planet that had been lost, a word that had become, in the months since the Accords were signed, something between a legal term and a promise, a shorthand for the principle that no world full of living people could simply be reclaimed, that every sentient being in the galaxy had the right to exist without it being described as an inconvenience to someone larger. Kepler's Reach. It was in the text of the Accords 17 times. It was the name of the court's founding document. It was the name Cross had given his flagship. It would be the name, she had been told, of the first new colony humanity established in the coming year, a colony on a world near the original system, where volunteers from across human space had already begun to apply for settlement, because some things needed to be rebuilt simply to prove that they could be. The children in the park kept playing. Their laughter kept moving across the golden air. Oren stood under an alien sun on a world that was finally, genuinely free, and she let herself feel what that meant. All of it. The loss that had made it necessary and the cost that had made it real and the hope that was, somehow, still there on the other side, still growing, still stubborn, still refusing to be convinced by any amount of darkness that the only reasonable response was to give up. That was the thing about human beings, she thought. The thing that the Varrock Dominion had not understood when they sent the beacon and delivered the ultimatum. The thing that no species that had ever simply surrendered to a larger force had quite grasped about the particular and difficult and occasionally magnificent species that had crawled out of one small blue world and pointed itself at the stars. They had called it an act of reclamation. History would call it something else, the last mistake anyone ever made in assuming that humanity was anything less than exactly what it had always been. Dangerous when cornered, unstoppable when grieving, and when given the choice, unfailingly, stubbornly, magnificently merciful. Oren watched the children play. Above them, the stars were waiting, countless and cold, and full of worlds not yet reached, mysteries not yet solved, species not yet met, futures not yet built. The galaxy was very large and very old, and most of it was still unknown. And somewhere in all of that darkness were undoubtedly things that would challenge and surprise and test the fragile, careful, hard-won peace that the Reach Accords had begun. There would be more work. There was always more work. But for this moment on this afternoon under this golden sun, the children were playing. And that was enough. That was exactly, precisely, what 4.2 million people had deserved all along. That was what had been answered for.